Okay, hello. I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for coming to this talk. I know there's a range of really interesting lectures and talks going on right now and all throughout the conference or gathering, so it's really nice that you've come along to this one. Just to start by introducing myself, my name's Nat. Hello. And I am a language producer. Now, normally when I say this to people, what's your job? I'm a language producer. They say, what? And to be fair, it doesn't really make that much sense as a job title. But effectively what it means is I work for a company which makes language learning software. They have an extremely ambitious project to create language learning software in over 200 languages, and it's my job to make that happen. So I'm the producer. Some of the, just a very small sample of the ones that we do are up on the screen here. I'm sure between you, you'll be able to identify most or all of these languages. And my specific role is to research each and every one of the languages that we want to produce and try and sort of work out in advance if there are going to be any difficulties or pitfalls or little snags which will make it difficult to translate from English. And there are always so many of them. And then I supervise the production, so work with the native speakers to help get the text translated, work with native speakers to get it recorded. So that's sort of, that's where I come from. And to give you just a little bit of background to the what exactly I'm sort of talking to you about today, it's translating 140 languages. So our goal is to do 200 languages eventually. We're currently on number 140, which, in case anyone's interested, is going to be Southern Sami, an extremely endangered language spoken in Scandinavia. And why I've come here to talk to you is because I have been on the lookout for quite a long time for an audience which is going to appreciate all of those tiny little quirks and oddities that make languages different. So I find back in London, where I come from, very often I'm talking with my friends from university who've perhaps gone into law or finance and keep getting ever more corporate jobs and ever more senior responsibilities. And personally, I keep getting really fixated still on the really minor issues of translation. So what is the best way to translate tomato ketchup into Latin American Spanish? It's a big problem for me. Should it be la salsa de tomate, which, excuse my accent by the way, which is apparently fine in Honduras, that would be completely understood for ketchup? Or should it be ketchup, which would be fine in Peru, where a salsa de tomate would be more perhaps any tomato sauce, not necessarily specifically ketchup? Or should it even be catsup, which would be fine in Mexico and equally understood alongside ketchup? Now I hope that you'll all agree that these are the really big problems in life. And if anyone's going to appreciate them, then it's definitely the people at the Polyglot gathering. So share the journey with me. Now, the way we work is, and really the only way this project can be managed, is that we use one source language. And the reason we do this is that this helps us keep a certain amount of consistency. So everything happens from English. English is our starting base. So we'll translate the same script from English into Spanish, English to Tok Pisin, English to Indonesian, English to Southern Sami again, English into everything. Everything starts from English. Now, what this means is that there is only one step in the translation process, if you see what I mean. So there's only one amount of translation creativity that happens. The obvious thing for someone like us would be to use the translations to then get more languages, more obscure languages produced. So, for example, we would translate from English into Spanish and then maybe use the Spanish translation to translate into Aymara or Guarani or a language a smaller language which is spoken in perhaps a Spanish-speaking part of the world. That would be the obvious thing to do. But it's difficult, or we try to avoid doing that, because the problem then is that you have 2 stages, or sometimes even more, in your creative translation process. So, for example, if we had gone with la salsa de tomate for tomato ketchup in Latin American Spanish, and then used that translation for the Aymara translator, they wouldn't have access to the original English ketchup, and might translate it more as a tomato sauce, which in the Spanish it can also be, than as specifically a ketchup. So we bring everything back to English, we start from English all the time. And so we keep our consistency. But it does obviously cause quite a lot of difficulties having just one source language, because the thing is, no 2 languages perfectly correlate. That never happens. There's always differences in the way that they approach certain, even minor issues. I mean, just off the top of my head, in English, you can ask for, say, a boiled egg without having to specify whether it's a soft-boiled egg or a hard-boiled egg, which is not always the case in every language. You can talk about your brothers and sisters in English without having to say whether they're older than you or younger than you. I can address you, a group, or you, an individual, without having to make any distinction in the language that I'm speaking. And in fact, without even having to decide in my head which option I intend. And I find this is particularly distressing for those who like a little bit of juicy gossip and come to English as a secondary language, that in English we can talk about friends and partners without having to specify whether they're male or female. So keep everyone guessing. But obviously, it flips around as well. So in English, sometimes you find that English is too nuanced, where another language is not, perhaps doesn't make a distinction. And my best example of this is the lemon and the lime. Now, to an English speaker, to many speakers of many languages, these are 2 completely different things. So this one is a lemon, and that one is a lime. This one is yellow, big, oval, very acidic. That one is smaller, round, green, possibly a little more refreshing, a bit more sprightly. They're 2 different fruits, essentially, with different names. As different as a lemon and a grapefruit, a lime and an orange. But this isn't actually the case in every language. There's many, many languages where exactly the same word would be used for these 2 fruits. I think an example is Egyptian Arabic, where just the word lamuna could be used to describe either of these 2. Sometimes in such languages, you might, if you were really pushed, you might add the word green to one of them to sort of really force a distinction. Now, when this becomes problematic for us or not problematic, intriguing, interesting, quirky, is we find that when we present one of our translators with either just the lemon or just the lime, they'll translate it, in the way that it would be translated in their language. So let's say we give them the picture of the lime, they translate it as lamuna in Egyptian Arabic. And then separately, or to a different translator, we give the picture of the lemon, and they translate it as lamuna. Fine, no problem. But we find when we give them both options together in a list, one after the other, the temptation is to try to replicate the distinction that is made in the source language, in this case, English. So there is a slight temptation to sort of, I think the idea is to help the learner out a little bit by helping them to sort of see what the difference would be in the language they're learning. But the risk to the learner is that then they're not necessarily learning the most natural way to say that thing in the new language. So if they're learning a lime as a green lemon, but that's really not very used in colloquial Arabic, it's possibly not the most useful thing for them to do. So, whoops, no. This is all by way of introduction, really. I do have something of an agenda today, because we could talk for hours and hours about minute little differences between language, for example, the lemon and the lime, the hard and the soft-boiled egg. But throughout our project, we've come up with 3 issues which are really consistently quite problematic. So many languages have different approaches to these three things: time and numbers, family, so the names of family members, and colours. And I think the reason these ones are quite interesting to focus on is because this isn't just about learning new vocabulary. It's not about learning a new word for something. These three issues are about sort of getting your head into a slightly different mentality. When you learn the new language, you're learning a slightly different way to appreciate the world around you. I think we'll start with time, because this is the one that tends to really boggle people's minds the most, I think. Now, I actually don't know what time it is now, and it's also irrelevant, because when I made this presentation, I made the assumption it would be 10:30 at the time I'm saying this, which it is not, but never mind. So let's all pretend, if you don't mind, that it's currently 10:30 here in Bratislava. Now, in English, I can say 10:30 or 10:30, doesn't matter, both fine, but it's very clear what the time is. And that's my clock. Sorry. And that's my time, 10:30. However, if I was an Amharic speaker, let's say, then I'd be looking at exactly the same clock face. It would look exactly the same, but instead of me saying it's 10:30, I would be saying it's 4:30. Yes, that's exactly the reaction I was hoping for. And if you're like me, first time I came across this, you'll be thinking, what? Or indeed, что, che cosa, quoi, or any other variant of that you can think of, because this really is quite difficult to get your head around first time you see it. Basically what's happening here is in Amharic time, also Swahili time, and a couple of other languages around that equatorial area, is the day is starting at a different time. So I think everywhere, certainly in Europe, probably most places in the world, the day begins at midnight, essentially. So the first hour of the day is the first hour after midnight. That's our 1 o'clock. But it's not the case in Kenya, where the day actually starts at daybreak, essentially, so what we would call 6 a.m. And the first hour of the day is therefore the first hour after that. So what we would call 7 o'clock for them is 1 o'clock. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you know about it, but I think for learners of those languages from a language which doesn't do that, it's really it's quite confusing, especially if you've put the effort into learning your numbers really well, because you then see a clock face which is, to you it's 2 o'clock. That's what you're trying to say, and you're like, why am I putting a 4 in there? Surely something's gone drastically wrong here. I mean, I think even if we move a little closer towards or into Europe, time can be quite a confusing issue for language learners, even within the languages in Europe. So, I mean, I remember I was meeting a colleague a couple of months ago, and we arranged to meet at 4:30 in the afternoon. And at 3:30, I got a call from him, and he said, "I'm here, where are you?" I said, "Well, you're an hour early." We said 4:30. And there was a very, very long pause, and then he said, "Oh, I was thinking in German time." Because, of course, what happened is that whereas in English we go past the hour, so it's 4:15, 4:30. In German time, and I think quite a few Slavic languages, you're sort of living in the hour. So me mentioning a 4 made him think I was saying half of the 4th hour, which would have been 3:30. So, unfortunately, chaos ensued. No, it didn't. No, I just met him a bit early. It was fine. But as I say, to a learner, you kind of have to get your head into these slightly different mindsets. To translators, this bit's actually fine. It's not an issue. There is no ambiguity. It's more when you're approaching the language, you have to sort of be aware of the differences. So this sort of brings us on to numbers, which is another fairly Well, in our project, for example, we count up to 100, which is a fairly small set of numbers to do, and yet it causes a huge amount of problems. You wouldn't believe how much difficulty comes out of trying to translate numbers up to 100 in over 100 languages. And the reason really is that languages use different base units to count. So in English and Italian, it would be tens, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, etc. In other languages, it might be based on something else. In Chichewa, for example, which is a language spoken in Malawi, they count in units of 5. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or, if you indulge me a moment, Chimodzi, 1, Ziwiri, 2, Zitatu, 3, Zinai, 4, and Zisanu, 5. So they all have their own individual names for those numbers. But then when you get beyond 5, you have to start doing some maths. So to say 6, you would say Zisanu ndi ziwiri. Oh, no, Zisanu ndi chimodzi, which is 5 plus 1. To say 7, you would say Zisanu ndi ziwiri, which is 5 plus 2, and so on. Now, 10 then has its own number, kumi, but when you get on to 11, you have to go back to 10 plus 1, 10 plus 2, 10 plus 3, 10 plus 5 plus 6. And it gets a little confusing after you get past 20. Makumi asanu ndi anai ndi mpambu zisanu ndi modzi. Which is a bit of a mouthful. What is happening here is 5 tens plus 4 tens plus 5 plus 1. So this is the Chichewa version of the number 96. Now you can imagine if you were using Chichewa numbers all the time in your life, things would get a little mathematically difficult, if nothing else. And we actually realized 2 things from recording Chichewa, 2 sort of practical things from the numbers. The first was that we needed to leave a lot more time to record Chichewa than we did a European language or many other languages. Because it just takes so much longer to say this than it does 96 or 96 or something, the equivalent in most other languages. And the second interesting thing is that because this is so long, because it does involve such a large sum, what Chichewa speakers tend to do is after they get past about 5, when they get to the point where they start having to do the sums, they often switch over to English. So you'll find a dual use of languages in Chichewa. You might, if you were going to the market, say, and buying 5 tomatoes, you'd probably do that in Chichewa. But if you were ordering, 36 tomatoes for some strange reason, then you would probably say 36y or some sort of a loan word of English, because it's just too complicated otherwise. And the same is true of time. I mean, imagine if you were telling the time in Chichewa, I mean, it wouldn't even fit on the slide. It would be far too big. So that happens in English as well. They borrow the English words. So we've covered time and numbers. And whilst I was sort of writing and thinking about time, I just wanted to go into a little sort of side thought, because it occurred to me that time is also something we bring into our greetings quite a lot. In English particularly, I think also a lot of European languages. So you'll say good morning, then good afternoon, then good evening, and there's quite distinct times of day when they're okay to use, and then after that time is gone, it's quite inappropriate. I wouldn't say good morning at even 5 past 12. It would sound very peculiar. I think the same, I guess, in Slovak, I suppose, where there's the dobre rano, or sorry again for the accent, and dobry den, and then etc. But this isn't actually the case in all languages, of course. I mean, you're all multi-linguists. You'll all know this, but I think for a lot of learners, and even sometimes for translators sort of presented with the problem of how to translate good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, it can be a bit perplexing if in the language you're translating into, there isn't a direct equivalent. So for example, let's take French. Now in French you can use I mean, technically there exists a word or the phrase bon après-midi, which literally would be good afternoon. But unless I'm mistaken, I don't think anyone would really ever use it. It would sound very odd, very unnatural. People would probably mark you out as a non-native French speaker. Instead, bonjour would be absolutely fine and much more acceptable at all times of the day. And it's similar, say, in Hindi, where, again, you could technically render good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but it would sound particularly weird, and instead namaste can be used at any time in the day. So to sort of bring in some other elements, I found that in greetings, if they're not time-specific, they can also be, or they tend also to be something to do with health, or even destination. So I don't know if we have any Finnish speakers here. Would I be right in saying you can say terve in Finnish as a sort of hi? And would I be right in saying that literally translates as sort of health? Yes, good, thank you. Phew. So yeah, you have the health option. In Fijian, you actually use olaive, which is a question, and it's where are you going? So you meet someone in the street, you stop them. The question you first ask, where are you going? And they will either reply with a very specific destination if they like you and trust you, or maybe just somewhere over there if they don't want you to know exactly where they're going. And then, of course, other languages will have different variants of greetings depending on who you are as the speaker. So I think in Icelandic, I'm not sure there's a difference in the audio, but you have a male and female differentiation in the hello. So cycle and cycle. Thank you so much. I was going to say, if anyone can come and correct me afterwards, that would be great. Thank you. And then, of course, other languages where you vary the greeting depending on who you're talking to. So a lot of the Polynesian languages will have totally different registers, perhaps an informal register, a formal register, maybe even a royal register, which have absolutely separate vocabulary so that you can choose the appropriate one for your audience. Which sort of brings us on nicely to relationships. And we are talking about family members. We knew... Hello? We knew a long time before starting this project that family members were going to be really quite tricky. So, I mean, even from my own experience thinking about it, I lived in Russia for a while and was with a friend who said, we're going to, let's go and meet my brother this evening. And I said, I thought you only had a sister. I knew him quite well by this stage. I'm sure you've only got a sister. And he said, yeah, but my brother, my mum's sister's son. I was like, that's surely a cousin. And Russian does have separate words for cousins, of course. You have the dvayurodny brat for the male cousin, the dvayurodnaya sestra for the female cousin. But I found colloquially the dvayurodny part, which is like the once removed element, often gets dropped. So you end up sort of talking about a brat, a brother, which in very informal speech could also mean a male cousin. A bit confusing. And then to add into this confusion, several languages will borrow terms from family members to use as a sort of respectful term for people who aren't family members. Now, I think in Polish, for example, you can use the term for aunts, ciocia? Yeah? Yes, thank you. To refer to perhaps an elder female person who isn't a blood relative, sort of a respectful term. Great. And it can get even more complicated when you do actually intend a blood relative and you're talking about your aunts and uncles. In English, very simple, an aunt is an aunt, an uncle is an uncle. But in, say, Latin, you have the difficulty that you have to specify whether it's your paternal uncle or your maternal uncle. So patrus would be your paternal uncle, your brother's brother. Avunculus would be your mother's brother. You already have a very much more precise idea of who your subject is than in English, which I guess can be both a benefit and maybe a disadvantage at times. Let's make it even more complex and go to Hindi, where you have the paternal and the maternal different sets of vocabulary, but you also have different words depending on whether the uncle is, say, your brother's elder brother or your brother's younger brother. So your chacha would be your father's younger brother, but your taya would be your father's elder brother. Whew, yes. It's the same with grandparents. Are they your maternal or your paternal? Grandchildren, are they your son's children or your daughter's children? There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to family members, which is a little unexpected, I think, in a way, because family members are one of the first things certainly most children learn in languages, and you approach that with the assumption that, father is this, mother is this, sister is this, aunt is this. It's really not that simple, and I think the most unique system I've come across in all of the languages we've worked with is probably Basque, where you would use different words for your siblings depending on whether you're a male or a female speaker. So I, for example, as a female, would refer to my brother as my neighbor, but a male speaker would refer to his brother as his anaya. So two totally different words for different for the different gender of the speaker there. And similarly, when it comes to colours, which is the last of the big, the really big sort of systematic difficulties, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all either. And there's a lot of research, I'm sure you'll all have read something about how colours work differently in different languages. Essentially what it comes down to is that there are different numbers of basic colours in different languages. So in English we have 11 basic colours. In Russian it's 12 because there are two different blues. There's the light blue, the голубой, and the dark blue, the синий, whereas in English we just have the one. In many languages there are far fewer colours. I think a few languages just have black and white, or perhaps black, white and red. A lot of colours will combine all of the shades of blue and green into something which linguistically gets called GRU. There is no linguistic distinction made between these two shades. In Zulu, it's luhlaza would be the word that you would use for any of these colours. The distinction isn't particularly clear. So I think we've sort of covered what I like to call the mind-blowing, those three things, which for language learners are really, I think it's one of the joys of learning a language, and that you have to really get into the mindset of how that language is working. It's not about finding a specific translation for green as opposed to blue when that doesn't exist, or trying to specify in English that the aunt I'm talking about is my father's younger sister. It's about getting into the mindset of the new language and using it within the structure it has put in place, I think. Just to sort of finish up, to bring it back to a sort of interesting, quirky, polyglot level, I just want to go through a couple of last little items that we've come across, which I thought are quite fun. Now, I've called this Missing Translations, which is really not a very good title because it's not about missing translations, it's about differences and diversity and, as I say, the way things are approached slightly differently. So Missing Translations was a horrible title. I don't know what I was thinking. Must have been quite late at night. But the idea is where there's sort of where two languages don't really fit together, they don't really correlate on certain issues. Now, the first one is the word please, because this is, I think, one of the first words you want to know in a language. Certainly when I was coming to Bratislava, it was one of 5 words I said, I definitely will need that one, I'll use it more than anything else, please. Absolutely, one of the first things you know. But it doesn't exist in every language. And again, to go back to Finnish, there doesn't seem to be a literal translation which will work in every case that please will work. Different things are tried, so you might add kiitos, which is thank you, to the end of a sentence in Finnish to sort of imply the politeness. Or you might sort of use a conditional tense, again, to sort of make something a little more polite than just, the straight, give me this, would you give me that? And there are one or two other sort of variations which people sometimes suggest, but essentially any translation of please in Finnish will be a little ambiguous or won't quite fit in every case, which is particularly distressing for, I think, for English native speakers who are so known to be, so famous for saying please far too much of the time, at every possible opportunity, please. And then to go into a language where you have to get used to not using it in the same way, and sometimes not really quite using it at all, it's quite, it can be a little distressing. And now to move on to another, which I think we probably nearly everyone here takes for granted, the simple yes and no. Again, some of the first words you ever learn in a language, but they're not always there. So in Manx and Scottish Gaelic, are you a Manx speaker? Oh, brilliant, fantastic. Well, you can hopefully confirm this then, that there is no literal translation of yes or no. There's no one word which will always fit. Instead, I think what tends to happen is the verb will be used to sort of, to affirm or negate something. So I guess, do you want to come, for a coffee? I want or I don't want. Makes complete sense, but it's quite difficult to get your head around. I think possibly for Russian speakers, this isn't quite as alien, because obviously you have the da and the niet, but I think, hopefully I'd be right in saying that quite often in Russian, people will use the verb to sort of affirm something as well. So like, I don't know, ты хочешь something, do you want something? Я хочу, or just хочу. Perhaps there's a sort of, instead of the yes, just say I want. And even I think in Latin, the translation of yes, I see someone nodding, this is a good sign, is Itawero? Does that be right? Oh, it's different. Okay. I see. Okay, fine. So I think in this room everyone obviously has an extremely good grasp of, these being not problems, but lovely, lovely things that we can think about and get our heads around. And yes.
Maybe we should repeat the old things and divide the Roman language in three. Those that have used the Latin sic and become sick.
Uh-huh.
Those that have used the Roman il, we, and those who just use up, lambda.
Oh, now that's very interesting that the different usages of Latin have moved into the current breakdown of European languages in the use of how they use yes and no. Well, I think I'm probably done now, so thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed a little insight into my brain, essentially, and all the things that go flying around in it, whilst trying to work out the best way to work with an infinite number of languages. And if I could just add before, if anyone has any questions, I'm always interested in recording new languages, particularly some of the more endangered or minority languages in the world. So just in case anyone has a particular interest in something like, I don't know, Cree or Navajo or anything you think is a bit underrepresented, then do feel free to come and talk to me at any point, because I'd like to talk to you. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Pass the microphone.
Actually, I was going to ask about endangered minority languages, but you already said it, so never mind. No. The question is, what other minority endangered languages are you working with and on? And have you gotten any pushback from those communities who feel that their language is kind of, proprietary and they don't want to see it moved out into the commercial world?
We've actually had, our company's been going for about 25 years, so we've got a bit of history, so people can kind of rely on us a bit. And we have had quite a few communities come to us out of the blue and say, could you help us with our language? And actually, Southern Sami, which I mentioned at the beginning, is one where we were actually approached by the community, and they said, we'd like this as one of the resources to help our children firstly learn, and then but with other languages we've tried to record. So I think, for example, Upper Sorbian, we were quite keen to work with fairly recently, and I think because obviously that's in a slightly difficult position at the moment, they felt that or rather the specific people we talked to, I think, felt that there might be slightly more useful ways for them to work with the language right now, when it's in a bit of danger, to do perhaps a textbook or something a bit more traditional than what we do as an app. So I think, if a language is very under-resourced and in a lot of trouble, we might not be the first people they come to, even though what we do is the audio element, so it's quite a nice way of preserving the spoken part of the language and helping people to learn. And then, it depends. We haven't actually approached any communities yet where I think they wouldn't want us to sort of take their language. But I'm sure when we try to do perhaps some of the indigenous languages of Australia or maybe Canada, it could be an issue. I can definitely see that being a problem. Or, not a problem again, eh? Yeah.
Hi, and thank you for the talk. It was very good. So 2 questions. Firstly, I just want to add a little quirky thing about the Scandinavian languages. The family names for the grandparents are literally translated father, mother, mother, father, 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 and mother, mother. So it's very intuitive to mother, mother is obviously your mother's mother. So and this works for uncles as well, father, brother, sister, so forth, father, sister. So it is very intuitive for learners. And the second question is, do you ever actually have trouble finding a native speaker of minority language that does not, to find one who speaks it to a sufficient quality level? Thank you.
Yeah, we have a huge amount of trouble. For our project, we require at least 4 native speakers for every time we make a new product. So 4 native speakers of each language. And the difficulties we have, especially if it's a minority language, is we find it difficult to know how good they are. With something like French, for example, it's very easy to find really good quality translators and perhaps voice artists who have a very standardized accent, the sort of thing that's very useful to learn from, because we can check with hundreds of people. We can send audio files all around the world and say, what do you think of this? Have they got this right? Is it the right pace? Is the accent exactly correct? And we can have it verified. But if it's something like, we'll say Manx or Cornish even, which is another we're quite keen to do, there's only so many people you can choose from, and it's, we don't have very many people we can call on to help check through that. So it's certainly a problem. Luckily, quite a lot of minority languages, not all of them by any means, but a lot of them seem to have got together into a sort of protection unit of some sort. So quite often you can go to sort of the governing body of the language, and hopefully they'll help. If they don't, we're a bit stuck.
Yes, thanks for your talk. There were a lot of interesting examples of what problems there can be in translation, but what I was waiting curiously is, how did you solve them? So how did you solve the catch-up problem? How did you solve the addressing friends problem or missing translations problem? So maybe you can give some examples.
Actually, the catch-up one is quite an interesting example, because what we're doing there is Latin American Spanish. Thank you. It's a really big area. There are obviously variants of, the example is that 3 different things would be slightly more appropriate in different countries. What we're always going for, if we're saying it's Latin American Spanish, is the thing that will be most understood. So in that case, it was a discussion initially between our translators, and then we opened it up, because you can do that with Spanish, because there's so many Spanish speakers, sort of to the to other people, to see what was best understood. And we went with that because for us it's about what's going to be most useful for the learner. Luckily when we started this project, we had a list of languages we knew we wanted to do, and we had a list of words we were going to do. So some issues we were able to solve before we even started, by researching quite a lot into what would work in certain parts of the world, what absolutely wouldn't. If there were things that really couldn't ever be translated in some of those languages we wanted. So, for example, with the colours, we have a list of colours that we use, which I think is 12 colours, and all of the languages that we produce will fit into that system. We don't actually do any of the languages which perhaps only have 3 colours, and there is really no way you can express yellow or pink. So some of them are sort of pre-solved, and we also very, very strongly focus on visual. So every bit of vocabulary you learn is accompanied by an image, and that often helps get the nuance across as well. So for example, with soap, in English you just say soap, you can use that for a bar of soap or a liquid form. But again, in quite a few languages, if you said soap and there was a picture of a liquid, you might use a different version, you might have to say liquid soap. So we find that having a picture there helps the translator know exactly which option we want. But sometimes there is a bit of a fight, to be honest. I seem to remember when we did Esperanto a little while ago, we had quite a big disagreement about the translation of a piece of cake. One translator desperately wanted it to be torto, and one desperately wanted it to be kuko. I think, does anyone speak Esperanto? Yes, are those kuko, am I right? I can't quite remember. 2 different things, 2 slightly different things, but because we had an image of a slightly ambiguous looking cake, which was kind of a gâteau with sort of a slightly tart-like cream on it. We had a very, very hours and hours of discussion. So yeah, it was very confusing. But essentially, it's and so this might be a bit of a disappointment as an answer, but it's a very individual. It comes down to the individual language, the individual item within the language, and trying to get as many people commenting on it as we possibly can to arrive at the solution. Not necessarily the solution which is technically absolutely accurate, but the solution that people actually use in everyday life more, and that will get them understood the most effectively.
Okay, 2 minutes left, so last question.
Great question. Thank you. So the company is uTalk, and the app is called uTalk. So that's a small U, big T, A-L-K. You can download it for free and have a look at it. And if you love learning languages, which everyone obviously here does, then it's quite a nice way to try out little bits and pieces, different words in some of the more obscure languages as well as some of the more mainstream. Thank you.